Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, when the crisis comes knocking. As the Eurozone dramas move closer to the centre, is Spain in line for a full bailout? Will Greece really remain in the club? And what will it take to sort this out? But it's been a big week in Europe, so that is where we are going to start. Because what's been seen for a long time as a periphery problem is now clearly headed towards the core. Think about the big economies, Spain, Italy, even France. Things are looking increasingly shaky. Spain's probably the most acute. The cost of borrowing is around 7% for Madrid at the moment. That's a psychological level, really, a level that, if you remember, Greece, Ireland and Portugal all needed international financial assistance. But there's some concern right now that the $125 billion Spanish bank bailout was botched. How? Well, the Eurozone's not lending to the banks directly. The money's being passed through the government, which in effect adds to the nation's debt problems and makes it more difficult for Spain to borrow money. How much do the banks need? Well, $125 billion has been set aside. The actual necessity could be as much as $80 billion, but there's nothing stopping the banks from revising that higher in the future as the economy gets worse. JP Morgan, for example, believes Spain's bailout will push the debt to GDP ratio up to 108%. It's only about 70% at the moment. And don't forget our old friend Contagion. That could yet take down Italy, which doesn't have the same property and unemployment-led crisis, but its debts do stand at 120% of GDP. In a moment, we will put all this into some context with the economics team at Citigroup, which was the first to say Spain would need a bailout. First, though, this from Paul Brennan in Spain.
Anyone wanting to understand how deep and desperate the crisis in Spain has become need look no further than the plight of Alexis and Rocio. At the start of this year, they lived in a publicly subsidised apartment, granted because of Rocio's physical disability. But after missing just 3 months' rent, they and their 11-year-old son were thrown out into the street. Already 85% blind, Rocio's sight is rapidly deteriorating. And as if things couldn't get worse, earlier this week she fell and broke 2 toes.
I can't be with my son either. I see my family is destroyed, wrecked. What hope am I going to have? The street. And not being able to see my child as he grows up when I lose my sight. What else can you ask for? I've got no hope at all.
These cardboard boxes, stored for them by a neighbour, contain their few remaining belongings. Each night, that neighbour takes in their son. But there is no room for the whole family. And Alexis and Rocio are currently sleeping rough in a nearby park. The effect on their son has been profound. His anger and distress evidenced clearly in this crayon drawing of the man responsible for evicting them.
I want to be with my father at home and not staying at neighbours. I want to be close to my parents and give them all my love.
How can I explain to him? I cannot find a job, though I look for it every day. I cannot explain to him many things.
It's a far cry from the days when his talent for sculpture saw him featured in newspaper articles.
It's impossible not to be moved by the plight of this family. But although extreme, their situation is far from unique. These apartment blocks on the outskirts of Madrid could actually be anywhere in Spain, places where rent arrears quickly lead to eviction and the fear of homelessness.
Right, as promised, we're off to London now to talk to an economist at Citigroup, which for a long time has been talking about the inevitability of a Spanish bailout. Ibrahim Rahbari is with us to discuss that. Ibrahim, thank you for your time. Spain got this sort of half bailout, a banking bailout. Do you think it'll actually work and really target the bank's instability, or, with the way the funds are being distributed, will the Spanish government be on the hook for it anyway?
I mean, there are 2 separate questions. The first is the bailout enough for the banks? And the second is it going to prevent the sovereign from needing a bailout of its own? And I think on both, the judgment cannot be too positive. On the first, I think we're not in a situation where we can say that even if that upper limit, the 100 billion that are supposed to come into the Spanish banks, they will not put all doubts to rest about the solvency of the Spanish banks. And when it comes to the sovereign, well, before we said that some form of a sovereign bailout was needed. And this bank bailout clearly hasn't done any favors to market access for the Spanish sovereign. And in fact, it's been credit negative for it by ending up on its balance sheet. So you can put 2 and 2 together. So I think there's still a high likelihood that ultimately we will see a Spanish sovereign bailout as well.
Especially given the fact you've got these borrowing rates, which are up around 7% these days, and if we use history, recent history as a guide, that was the point where Greece, Ireland, Portugal all had to go for their full sovereign bailouts, not just banking ones.
Yes, even though there are many different aspects. In some ways, secondary market yields don't matter so much because that's not actually the interest that the sovereign has paid. Most of the money was raised in the past at much lower interest rates, and that's the average interest burden it carries now. Even today, the money it raises, it's across the maturity curve, if you want. So some of it is more short-term at somewhat lower interest rates. So what really matters is, I think, market access, so actually having access to financing. And then to some extent there are all these indirect effects which play off the secondary market yields, which play off market values of these bonds, for example, as collateral for Spanish banks, for instance. So the yield developments are worrying, but they are not directly raising the cost of carrying the debt burden for the Spanish sovereign in the very immediate future.
Okay, let's shift focus to Greece, shall we? It's become more of a political story recently, what with the elections happening, I guess. But now we've got a government which wants to renegotiate the terms of the bailout. Now, is that just, as we say, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? I mean, are they actually going to need more money after this? And is there, actually I suspect there must be still a chance, at least, of Greece exiting the Eurozone at some point?
Yes, in fact, I don't see that probability having shifted markedly from where we were before. Before we were talking about a 50 to 75 probability of Greece exiting, and I think that hasn't moved very much at all. It is true that whatever government was to be in place after the election, and I do think we got more or less the best possible outcome, but whatever government would go to Brussels to seek a renegotiation was in any case due. The program is off track, and because it's off track, what they will need is more money. So more money will be needed in any case, and the question is the how and when. I think the terms that will be up for grabs are not all that many. I think they'll be offered somewhat more time, but there will be not much let up on the fiscal and structural reform. And then the question remains the same. To what extent can they deliver on the structural and fiscal reform conditionality? And I don't see the prospect of that having changed materially at all.
What are your thoughts then on the old issue of contagion? I described all of this earlier in the program as what was seen as a periphery problem, the southern states potentially dragging everyone else down. Is that still the case? You know, the idea of, for example, Italy being the next to go, or, dare we say it, even spreading into the bigger economies, even the Frances and the Germanys, which have looked comparatively resilient through this whole crisis?
Well, I mean, there's the issue of contagion, and then there are just different countries which are in trouble on their own, if you want. So the issue of contagion from Greece, say, would clearly be a relevant question if we saw Greece exiting, or we saw some form of a bailout, and people would make a more or less psychological association maybe between the experience in Greece and the experience possibly elsewhere. But I think the more important and relevant question is that these other countries, Spain and Italy most importantly, are confronting challenges of their own. There are different challenges than Greece, there are some similarities, but clearly they are of an even bigger importance, and they're simply in terms of the size much harder to be addressed by the rest of Europe. And we have to concern ourselves with those challenges. I don't think contagion necessarily is the best way of thinking about them.
But all told, Ibrahim, is Europe on the right track? This is a question I've been asking guests on this program for what feels like years, and actually it probably has been years that we've been asking this. Is Europe on the right track? With its leadership from the likes of Chancellor Merkel in Germany, is there a path here towards some sort of conclusion, maybe a few years down the track?
I mean, the path isn't clear. I mean, that is clear, that the path hasn't really been finalized. We are moving in the right direction. I mean, the latest developments, for example, banking union, I think is a necessary condition for the survival of the euro area. But clearly, politicians are moving, and to some extent can only move somewhat slower than markets would wish for, and markets often expect. And I think that likely will not change in the near future, not least because it's often not just a question of political leadership anymore. It's not in Merkel's authority or those of many other governments, to put into place the very fundamental changes that are needed or that many people expect for this crisis to be resolved. So the questions about, for example, Eurobonds or some further degree of political integration, these are not issues that can be resolved in a late-night session over a weekend between even the 17 members of the Eurogroup, for instance. I do also think, though, that we are somewhat putting too much weight on Merkel's leadership in particular. I mean, she is clearly a very central player in this, but the leaders of, in particular now, the Spanish and Italian government have huge significance for the further revolution. What they can bring to the table, in particular in terms of fiscal and structural reform, matters immensely, and it matters immensely also for the willingness of Angela Merkel to go further. So I do think we would do well in focusing a little bit more on the leadership in those other countries and what they are able and willing to concede in order for the euro area to be able to put this crisis behind it.
Ebrahim Rahbari there from Citigroup with some very salient points on this euro crisis. Thank you for your time, Ebrahim.